Hi everyone and Happy New Year. Welcome to Pinnacle 21's first webinar of 2021 titled Controlled Terminology Best Practices, Harmonizing Data to Promote Consistencies Across Clinical Trials. Briefly, I'll give a quick introduction. My name is Sarah Angelo and I'm a Principal Consultant here at Pinnacle 21. I'm a CDISC SME and a user advocate, so I help train our enterprise users on how to use this system, as well as answer CDISC and submission-related questions. Real quick, if you have any questions during this webinar, feel free to click this icon and enter your question at any time. Any questions that are entered will just be answered at the end. So for the agenda today, we will go over the definition and importance of controlled terminology. Then we'll go over some common incorrect extensions seen throughout the industry. Then we will go over the Pinnacle 21 validation, and I can provide some fix tips. Then there's new validation checks. And lastly, best practices. Controlled terminology definition. So what is controlled terminology? Well, it's data standards that provide consistent meaning to data, and this is across the various information systems, programs, and across the different agencies. It provides a more uniform structuring, format, and definition of the data. It's also terminology standards, which consist of controlled terms that are used for submission, but it also refers to FDA MDR adverse event codes. Then there's the CDISC CT terminology standards, which are grouped into the subsets of SDTM, CDISC, ADAM, SEN, Define, and Protocol. The CDISC CT terminology standards are updated quarterly. Then there's also the external dictionary terminology. Just to name a few, there's MEDRA, HUDRUG, and SNOMED. For the CDISC controlled terminology files, these can be downloaded through the NCI Enterprise Vocabulary Services website. At the bottom of the slide, I have provided a link to that NCI website for reference. This is a screenshot of what you might see at the NCI website. So as shown, this is the SDTM subset. And in the middle of the screen, you can see the various formats available for download. If you are a Pinnacle 21 Enterprise user, you can also view the CDISC control terminology files within the Enterprise system. If you are an Enterprise user and you're looking at the screenshot and saying, this is not what my screen looks like, well, this is because this is a sneak peek of the Enterprise 5.0 version that should be rolling out here in the near future. We are super excited about 5.0, and it has a lot of really nice new features. So once it's available and you upgrade, this is what the screen will look like. So to access these control terminology files, you will navigate to the left panel and select metadata, and then select terminologies. Then the SDTM, SEND, and ADAM control terminology files will display with the version on the right. Importance of controlled terminology. So why is controlled terminology important? Well, first off, it's required for submission for FDA and PMDA. It's part of the CDISC compliance, but controlled terminology also assists the reviewers when reviewing submission packages. It helps with predictability, consistency, and transparency, and it helps make the review more efficient. Then there's also that CDISC component. So CDISC provides the submission control terms and definitions that help harmonize the data. And this aids with the data exchange and interpretation. It also provides consistency across the systems and the studies. Control terminology also helps with the execution of our analytical tools. It helps to automate, validate, and review and with analysis. And then control terminology helps facilitate the cross-study comparative analysis. It helps to improve the patient safety and the outcomes, which is significant. So requirements. There are requirements for control terminology. There's agency requirements. So there's the FDA and PMDA technical conformance guides that list specific requirements. Just to name a couple examples, in the FDA TCG, they suggest that the latest version of the CT to be used at the start of the study, that the same MEDRA version for ISS be used, and then the exact case and spelling of the terms be used. Similarly, the PMDA TCG states the exact case and spelling of the terms, but also they state that the same version of CT be used within the clinical study. There's also CDISC requirements. So CDISC has published non-extensible and extensible code list. So for non-extensible code list, this means that terms should not be added to the code list. The expectation would be that the sponsors would only use the published list of terms provided by CDISC. Extensible code list means that controlled terms may be added to the code list if needed by the sponsor. Here in a minute, a little later, I will show you where you can determine or how you can determine if a code list is non-extensible or extensible, which is found in your control terminology files. Just to name a couple examples, you have the non-extensible code list, which might be action taken within the study treatment. And then an example of an extensible code list would be route of administration response. One thing to keep in mind is if you are extending to a code list that's extensible, be sure to follow the CDISC submission value rules. Also ensure that you aren't doing a duplicate or using a synonym. Common incorrect extensions. So here's a list of some common sources of incorrect extensions that we see throughout the industry. So first, there's the free text data entry. This is why it's recommended to really try to avoid those free text data fields to avoid cases such as this. There's also incorrect extensions seen in the data collection design or through STTM mapping, or even the actual extensions of the CDISC code list. Also, there's the use of synonyms, misspelling or casing of terms, or even external dictionaries with unmatched coding. So I'll go over just a couple examples of these. We'll start with synonyms. So synonyms should not be used. Synonyms are only provided to help you map to the correct submission value provided by CDISC. So you might notice a screenshot at the top. This is our STTM IG. So as you can see, LB or is U, which is the original units variable found within the LB domain. The IG shows the associated code list of unit. So let's say in my raw lab data, I find a value of milligrams over milliliter being mapped to LB or as U. I would go to my control terminology file and filter on unit, codelist, which is shown at the bottom, and I would search for that raw value of milligrams over milliliters. And I'll notice that it is a CDISC synonym, which is found in the very right column of the screenshot. So what I would do is go to the left column titled CDISC submission value, and I will notice that that value should be grams over liter. So I would go into my LB program, and for LB or as U values that are being displayed as milligrams over milliliters, I would simply update it so it's being displayed as grams over liters. Sometimes there's hesitation on changing the raw data when you're mapping to SDTM, but in cases with such as this, which with synonyms, definitely update your data so the CDISC submission value is being displayed rather than the synonym. Another example of an incorrect extension would be mapping to other. So within the FDA Technical Conformance Guide, there is a section titled Use of Specific Controlled Term Other. So within this document, the FDA recommends not mapping to other, but rather search for other possible terms. If you do have instances where the term field is mapped to a D code of other, you would definitely need to provide a clear and rational explanation as to why this was needed in your reviewer's guide. So one really nice feature of Enterprise is that Pinnacle 21 Enterprise provides reports to check the data quality. So I'm showing one example here. This is the disposition report. So as you can see, it found in my data that there was a DS term mapped to withdrew to AE, but DSD code was mapped to other. So what I would do is update this DSD code to map to adverse event, which is found in my control terminology file shown at the bottom. So these reports are great to check for these mapping of other values. Pinnacle 21 validation and fix tips. So Pinnacle 21 has 6 CDISC validation rules. As shown, there's CT2001 to CT2006, and we'll go over those now. So CT2001, this is checking for variable value not found in non-extensible code list. So again, non-extensible means that terms should not be added to the code list. The expectation would be that the sponsors would only use the published list of terms. So the fix tip for this would be to verify the value in your raw data, then check the CDISC CT terms, and then lastly, you would need to update your data so that a CDISC submission value is used, and also ensure that the casing format and no typos within that CDISC submission value. So for an example of the CT2001, I'm showing a diagnostic message of PR stat value not found and not done non-extensible code list. So real quickly, I'll direct your attention to the column 3 in the screenshot at the bottom. You can see that this column is titled Code List Extensible Yes, No. This is how you would determine if the code list was non-extensible. As shown, it says no, so that's how I know that this is a non-extensible code list. Then I would go over to my CDISC submission value column, and see that the value should be not done in all uppercase. So I would go verify the value in my raw data. I might see that the not done is in prop case. So I would go update my programming so that PR stat value for not done was being mapped to the appropriate not done value found in the CDISC submission value column, and ensure that it's all uppercase. This is another example that we sometimes see for the CT2001 firing. This is cases where your CRF values might not be found in the non-extensible code list. So the fixed tip for this would be to verify the value in your raw data, then check for the CDISC CT submission values. Then there's a request denied document within the CDISC website. I will elaborate that on here a little bit later, but you can check this request denied document for your additional terms and see if the CDISC CT team has provided a recommendation on how to map to a CDISC submission value. If this is a case where your CRF design has instances like this, definitely make note and try to update your CRF design for the future studies. And then lastly, you would need to update your STTM data to ensure that the casing and format and spelling map to the actual CDISC submission value found in the control terminology file. So for the example on the left, I provide a couple examples of action taken with studied drug. So you can see there's values of none, drug discontinued, dose reduced, and then there's this dose postponed. Then sometime with the legacy studies, we see action taken with AE with additional values of hospitalization or CM given. So for the case with dose postponed, this is a special case. For this, you can see on the right screenshot, which is the action taken with study treatment, you notice that it is a non-extensible code list. So when we check for dose postponed, we don't see this value listed under the CDISC submission value column, and there's really no associated submission value that we can map it to. So for this case, it was determined to map action taken to the dose postponed, even though it was a non-extensible code list. The reasoning for this was that it was only a warning and not a reject. So since it was a warning and we needed to map it to dose postponed, we did so. And then in our reviewer's guide, we would provide a clear and rational explanation as to why we chose to map to dose postponed. So CT2002, this checks for variable value not found in extensible code lists. The fixed tip for this would be to verify the value in your data, check CDISC CT submission for other possible values. Also, again, ensure that a synonym is not used. And then if you do see that you're extending a code list, ensure that you are maintaining consistency within your study and the submission. Again, try to avoid free text in your data collection. Then also, if you do have a term that you would like to request it to be added, you can submit an added term request to the CDISC CT team. They suggest doing it as early as possible so you can try to have that term added for your study. And then lastly, if you do have to extend on that code list, you will have to provide a clear and rational explanation in your reviewer's guide. So on the bottom left, this is sometimes a message that you see for epoch. So as you can see, the diagnostic message states that the epoch value was not found in the epoch extensible code list. So again, we go to the code list extensible column and we notice it says yes. So yes, we can extend on this code list if needed. Then we look at the CDISC submission value. There is a submission value close to what we need, but when we looked at the study protocol, it was determined that we couldn't just use blinded treatment, that we actually needed blinded treatment 1 and blinded treatment 2. So on the right, I give an example of how you should provide an explanation in the reviewer's guide. So here we state that the new terms were added to extensible code list epoch for the study protocol needs. And then we list the values. So blinded treatment 1 and blinded treatment 2. So CT2003. This is checking for coded and decoded values. Do not have the same code in CDISC CT. So the fixed tip for this would be to review the CDISC CT. Again, ensure you're not using a synonym and avoid the misspelling of the terms. Also double check your STTM mapping. And then lastly, you'll have to update your programming to ensure that you're using the paired values with the same NCI codes. So this is checking for the test and test CD or param and param CD paired values. So at the bottom left, this is an example where the rule would fire. You can see that my LB test states triple phosphate crystals, and the LB test CD is the CYTYRO. So if I pull up my control terminology file and filter on these terms and their NCI codes, which are in the very left column, you can see that the CYTYRO has an NCI code of C74683, whereas the triple phosphate crystals lab test actually has an NCI code of the C7756. So these definitely don't match. So we would go and we would verify what correct test is needed in our LB domain. So on the right is the example. It was determined that the LB test was tyrosine crystals. So when I went to my control terminology file and I filtered on that, or tyrosine crystals, when I filtered on that, I could see that the NCI code was C74683. And when I filtered on that NCI code, it was determined that the LB test CD should be the CYTYRO. So I would update my data to display both those LB test and LB test name to be matching that same NCI code. So CT2004, 2005, and CT2006, these are very similar to the three that we just went over, the CT2001, 2002, and 2003. The only difference is that it's for the value level data. So Pinnacle 21 also has validation rules for the other dictionary and formats. So Medra has 12 rules, SNOMED has 8, MedRT has 4 rules, HUDRUG has 3 new rules, which we will go over here in a minute. LOINC has 1 new rule. Then we also have checks for the country and no flavor. So new validation rules. So there is a new rule for LOINC, which is the SD2285. This is checking LOINC value is not found in LOINC system. One thing to keep in mind is that the FDA requires LOINC only if it is provided by the labs. So sponsors should not be populating LOINCs by themselves. So only include it if it was provided by the labs, and then this validation check will be for that one code. So there's 3 new additional WHO drug validation. These validation checks only support the B3 format of WHO drug. So we sometimes get asked, why is it only supporting the B3 format? Well, that's because it's the only version listed in the FDA's data standard catalog. So if you are using the B3 format, these 3 new validation rules on the bottom will be checked. So you have the SD1344, SD1345, and then SD1346. So these 3 validation rules check the D code, class, and class CD, be populated with what is found in the WHO drug dictionary of that B3 format. So in cases that you might have a generic name that has many ingredients and therefore longer than 200 characters, be sure that you are following the guidance provided by WHO drug. So on the left, you can see there is this document titled How to Use WHO drug for Compliance with CM Domain in the CDISC SDTM standard. So on the right, this is a screenshot of what is provided in this document. So in cases where the CMD code, it stops at 200 characters. So if you have the generic name that is longer than 200 characters, WHO drug states that you should truncate CMD code after the semicolon closest to 200 characters. So as shown in their example, you have CMD code where they have magnesium, semicolon, and then they truncate it. Then you would need to utilize the supplemental data set as shown at the bottom. So as shown here, they use QName of CMD code 1, and then the remaining name will be provided in the QVal variable. At the bottom of the screen, I have referenced a link to this PDF if you need to reference this document. So best practices. Okay, so unit code list and the define XML. It is recommended as a best practice to be sure to split out your code list. So this is for variables ORAS U, stress U, and dose U. So they recommend splitting out and creating separate code lists for these variables. So on the left, this is a collapsed code list, which is not recommended. So this is a case where this unit code list contains every single unit term that is provided in all SDTM data sets. This doesn't really give a clear picture of the distinct values that were found in the data collection. So on the right, this is the recommended approach. So as you can see, using the ID and name columns, you can split out your code list. So here I have original units for LB, dose units for CM, and then dose units for EX. Then you can tell that the NCI code list code is still the same. You're simply just displaying the terms that are found in these unit variables by using that ID and name to split them out. And this really does give an accurate and clear representation of the distinct values that were found. So best practices for extensible CT. So first, again, try to control the data collection process. Try to avoid those free text data entry fields. Also, if you are extending the CT, try to maintain consistency, not only within the study and the submission, but definitely within the organization. So there's always several different study teams and programming teams. So if you can, try to maintain consistencies within these groups. This way, if you have a value that you're extending on, it's not being added in 20 different ways. So try to maintain consistencies. Also, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there is that denied terms document from the CDISC CT team. So I provided a screenshot at the bottom from the CDISC website. If you go to the resources tab, then as I circled in red, there is a link for the CT request denied document. So any terms that have been requested as an addition to the CDISC CT team, if those terms were denied, the CDISC CT team will update this denied terms document, and then they will also provide a response or suggestion on how to map that term to a CDISC submission value. So it's worth checking this document. Then you can also request a new term to be added. At the bottom, I've shown a link. So again, under the resources tab, there's the new term request page. So you would just simply request that your new term be added to the CDISC CT team. Again, they suggest doing as early as possible. So if they can be added, you can utilize them in your study. Okay, lastly, the reviewer's guide explanations. So let's say you have these items in your issue summary that you were unable to update within your SDTM data sets. You would definitely need to provide an explanation within that issue summary section of the reviewer's guide. So I've provided an example of an insufficient explanation and then an appropriate explanation. So the top, you can see the diagnostic message states for CT2002 that my CM dose U value not found in unit code list. So the explanation that was provided states that the code list is extensible. This is really not a valuable explanation. It doesn't provide what values were actually extended on. So the bottom is a more appropriate explanation. So you can see it was added that this rule fired for other drops and unknown values in CM dose U. These values could not be mapped to CDISC CT, but the unit code list is extensible. So this is a very clear explanation that will help our reviewer to determine what values had to be extended and added to this code list. Okay, time for questions. All right, let me look here. Okay. There were several questions that were entered, so I'm going to try to answer as many as I can. Okay, so the first question is, would you explain the difference between the user-defined code list and the extensible code list? Okay, this is a really good question. So a user-defined code list are any code lists that are in the define that represent what is in the study data. So let's see, an example of a user-defined code list would be a visit num with the visit decodes. Then for the extensible code list, so extensible code list refers to the CDISC control terminology code list that allow for the additional terms to be added by the sponsor. So you might be asking this due to some validation rules that you've seen. So for the user-defined code list, that would be the SD0037, which checks for the value for variable not found in your user-defined code list. So again, this is checking for the variable values should be populated with the terms that are found in your user-defined code list associated with that variable in your defined XML. So if you do run into cases like this, you'll want to verify what code list terms you have in your defined XML that is associated with that certain variable, and then go to your data and make sure that all of their possible values that are found in your data are in that defined XML. Then for the extensible code list, that's that CT2002 that we went over a little bit earlier, which is checking for the variable value not found in that extensible code list. So again, if you see this CT2002, try to find a CDISC value that you could possibly map to, or you can request your new terms to be added. Otherwise, you would just provide an explanation in your reviewer's guide as to why you needed to extend this code list with your additional term. That's a good question. Okay, so the next question here. Okay, can you please confirm that control terminology should be used for the original unit variables? There's often resistance on changing the original unit when there is existing CT. So yes, original units should use the CDISC control terminology, and this is to be CDISC compliant. So I gave an example for that LB or as U and provided that screenshot from the SDTMIG. So you can see in that screenshot that the LB or as U had that associated code list to unit. So in cases like this, yes, if you would want to ensure that you're not using a synonym, and then definitely check that the casing, format, and spelling map exactly to that CDISC value that is provided. Okay, the next question, let me see how much time we have. Yes, I have enough time for a couple more. Okay, are we allowed to modify CRF values? Sometimes it is not easy to map one-to-one to CDISC existing CT. Okay, so for this, sponsors, in the FDA Technical Conformance Guide, it states that the sponsor should provide the verbatim term that was collected on the CRF. And it also states that the most recent version of that CT be used at the start of the study. So really, the code list and terms should be considered during that data collection design process. But in instances that you have new terms, definitely submit them to the CDISC CT team as early as possible to see if those additional terms can be added to that code list for your study. If the CRF value is not in the code list, then they also recommend to try to find another CDISC submission value that you can map to. Okay. The next question is, since NCI CT is released quarterly, how long does it take for a new version to reflect in Pinnacle 21? Do I have to add it manually? Okay, this is a good question. You do not have to manually add new version of CTs into Pinnacle 21. Pinnacle 21 does that. They are typically available 2 to 3 weeks after a new release. Okay. The next question is, for WHO drug, why is the B3 format only supported in P21? So Pinnacle 21 only supports that B3 format because, again, it's the only version listed as supported in the FDA's data standard catalog. Okay, so the next question is, what should I do if I need to extend a non-extensible code list? So I briefly touched on this on one of my slides. So again, non-extensible code list, it's you should not be adding additional terms to. It is recommended that you try to find a map to a CDISC submission value. If this isn't possible, let's say due to that CRF design, then the FDA would recommend that you submit your new terms as early as possible to the CDISC CT team. Otherwise, you would have to provide a detailed description as to why you had to extend on this non-extensible code list in your reviewer's guide. Just one thing to note, if it is a reject error for a PMDA submission, then it would be best to communicate directly with the agency to discuss that. Okay, I think I have time for a couple more. Okay, the next question says, what should I do if I need a version of NCICT to validate against, but I don't see it in Pinnacle 21 Enterprise? Okay, so you can submit a service desk ticket and request additional CT versions to be added into the system if needed. So definitely feel free to submit a service desk ticket if needed. Okay, the next question is, why should I subset code list in the define XML? Wouldn't it save time and space in the define XML if I had one code list for multiple variables and data set? So again, collapsing a code list is really not recommended as a best practice. The code list should represent distinct values available at the data collection. So to accomplish that, you would need to split out your code list. And this really does aid in the review. Okay, I have time for one more question. Oh, this is perfect. They asked if my slides will be available. And yes, the slides to this webinar will be available. They will be uploaded to the Pinnacle 21 blog sometime after this webinar, and you will receive an email when they are uploaded for use. Okay, it looks like we're about out of time. There were a lot of questions that I was not able to get to, and I apologize for that. The good news is that any question that was submitted, it will be uploaded to the blog, and we will provide an answer for you. Again, my slides will be available also on the Pinnacle 21 blog for reference after this webinar. Real quickly, I would just like to thank everybody for taking the time out of your day to join us for this webinar. Definitely stay in touch with us. We have some more webinars coming through 2021 that will be great. So we look forward to seeing you in the next couple webinars. Thank you, everybody.